New Haven, Connecticut. The year is 1998. Two political scientists at Yale, Alan Gerber and Donald Green, set out to settle an argument the entire political industry had somehow never settled. The question was almost embarrassingly basic. Does any of the stuff campaigns do to get people to vote actually work? Not whether it feels like it works, not whether the candidate happened to win on election night, whether a knock on the door, a phone call at dinner, a card in the mail actually moves a real person from staying home to casting a ballot, and if so, by how much. So, Alan Gerber and Donald Green did something nobody in the business had bothered to do. They borrowed a method from medicine. They took a large group of voters and split it at random into two halves. One half got contacted, the knock, the call, the card. The other half, the comparison group, got nothing at all. Then they waited for the state to publish its official record of who had actually voted, and they counted the difference. If the contacted half turned out at a higher rate, the contact was what did it. Simple. And almost no one had ever run this test in politics before. And here's what they found. The phone calls, the workhorse of every campaign up to that point, the thing that they have spent fortunes on, moved turnout by almost nothing. The mail barely nudged it. The one thing that clearly worked was the oldest, plainest, least impressive tool in the kit. A real person standing on your doorstep, looking you in the eye, asking you to vote. That raised turnout by about 7 percentage points, bigger than the winning margin in just about every election campaign that's ever mattered. And here's the thing. This was more or less the first experiment of its kind run in American political science in 70 years. 7 decades, like a whole profession, billions of dollars, careers made and lost, and almost nobody has stopped to run the basic test. Yes, they knew what it felt like to execute on a tactic, but no one really understood whether it was that effective. And if they did, it was because, frankly, they were shilling for their own product, their own channel that they were specialists in. And if you ever sat in a meeting room where someone has defended doing something because, well, it's what we've always done, then you already understand the problem at the heart of this book. I have sat in several of those types of meetings, and this is the story of a small, stubborn group of people who got tired of guessing. Welcome to Masters in Public Affairs. I'm Joseph Labois, and this is the show where we go back to sometimes older books that still hold up, the ones that serious practitioners keep returning to because the fundamentals in them don't change even when everything else on the surface looks like it does. I've spent my career in this work on campaigns inside of government, and I'm going to be honest with you, this book made me wince more than once at just the degree to which oftentimes our profession always does what it knows to do without really seriously testing its own assumptions. That book is The Victory Lab: The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns by the journalist Sasha Issenberg. It was published in 2012. And the fact that Sasha Issenberg is a journalist, not a campaign operative, I think turns out to matter. He has no favorite tactic, no favorite strategy, no favorite channel that he is defending or advocating for. He just follows the evidence. And here's how it fits with what we've done before on this show. And don't worry, if you're new, you don't need to go through the entire back catalog. But in an earlier episode, we looked at Robert Cialdini, the psychologist who wrote Influence, a book about why people say yes, what actually makes a request land. In another, we looked at Damon Santola, a sociologist who studies how new behavior spread through a community. Both of those books are about why people do what they do. This book asks a different and, I think, frankly, uncomfortable question, which is, did anyone ever actually check whether our methods work? So let's call this the evidence episode. And the discomfort it creates can be a personal one, right? For me and maybe for you. Most of what we do in public affairs has never really been tested. And part of us likes it that way because work that is never measured can never be proven not to work. So this is a thing we're going to have to be honest with ourselves about as we work our way through this episode. All right, why does this book exist? So Sasha Issenberg's problem was a profession that explains itself for a living, but somehow never learns anything. The people whose job is to account for politics, the consultants, the candidates, the journalists, love to reach for big, tidy stories. It was the charisma. It was the momentum. It was the mood of the country. Stories that sound wise and can never be proven wrong as explanations for why a candidate, a campaign was successful or not. Here is how Sasha Issenberg puts it in the book's opening pages. The explainers cloak themselves in loose-fitting theories because they offer narrative comfort, unlike the more honest acknowledgement that elections hinge on the motivations of millions of individual human beings and their messy, illogical, often unknowable psychologies. The trouble isn't that these people aren't smart. It's that there is no feedback, no honest way to find out whether you were right. A campaign is a multi-million-dollar operation built for a single day. And the morning after the election, it simply dissolves. The files get thrown out, nobody holds a proper post-mortem, and the next campaign starts over from the same handed down folklore. A veteran Democratic campaign consultant named Steve Rosenthal once summed up the whole problem in 5 words. Asked how campaigns decide what to do, he said, "Most things are done with only one check: people's guts." And it had been that way for a very long time. Back in 1924, a political scientist at the University of Chicago named Harold Gosnell ran a careful little experiment. He mailed some Chicago residents postcards urging them to register and vote, left a comparable group of residents alone, and then measured the difference between them. And it worked. The postcards clearly moved people, and he published the result in 1927. The field admired it and then did nothing with it for a half a century. The political scientists retreated to the library to study voters from a safe distance. The campaign operatives stayed out on the street, never cracking open a journal, and neither side could answer the one question that pays the bills: what genuinely wins votes? That gap is what Sasha Issenberg set out to chronicle with this book. And notice whom he follows to do it. Not the celebrity strategists, not the big names that you might recognize in political campaigns, but the outsiders, the academics, the tinkerers, the data nerds that the industry likes to sometimes rolls its eyes at, because they were the only ones keeping an honest score. And this is a history of that method. It's not really a bag of tricks. So the next time you read one of your own quarterly reports, you're reporting out on a lobby day, the kind of document that probably counts how many meetings you took, how many op-eds your team has produced, may not always show whether any of it moved the thing you were actually tasked with moving. Remember Steve Rosenthal's line about guts. Okay, let's move on to the core idea. So for a century, campaigns ran on lore. The field experiment was the first instrument that could tell a campaign whether any of it was true. Everything else in this book, the targeting, the data, the clever mailers, hangs off of that move. Take something you believe, deliberately withhold it from a randomly chosen comparison group, and let reality guide you. It's tempting to shrink that down to use more data, but build a better list, deploy smarter ads, but the data is the downstream. The real idea is older, it's harder, and it's borrowed straight from medicine, the clinical trial. When a drug company tests a new pill, it gives the real pill to one randomly chosen group and a sugar pill to another and compares what happens. Alan Gerber and Donald Green, the 2 Yale scientists from our opening, wanted to talk about knocking on a voter's door with that same kind of rigor. A comparison group, an honest measure of the effect, and the humility that comes with both. They wanted to explain electoral behavior with the same degree of authority that doctors had in describing therapeutic care. Instead of patients, it would randomize individual households to separate the factors that affected voter participation. So why did it take until the 1990s for anyone to do this? Well, that's because the tool that everyone had been relying on for so long, and we learned about its importance in our episode on Joseph Napolitan, that tool was broadcast. It was television. It just cannot be tested in this way. You can't run an RCT, a random control trial, with television so easily. Like, you can't show a TV ad to one neighbor and hide it from the family next door because the signal blankets everyone at once. The only thing you can isolate cleanly are the one-to-one contacts, right? The knock, the call, the letter. So the moment the profession got serious about measuring, it was quietly pulled back toward the individual human being. The tool decided the subject. Test what you can actually isolate, and the thing you can isolate turns out to be, well, a person. Now, there are three mechanisms I got out of this book. I'll walk you through each of them. The very first is the engine is the field experiment, right? So let's go back to New Haven, to that New Haven study slowly this time, because how it's built is really the whole point here. So Alan Gerber and Donald Green took a large group of voters and divided them at random into two sets. One that would be contacted, one that would not. Because nobody chose who went into which group. The two groups end up on average alike in every way that matters, age, income, how reliably they usually vote, even the things you would never think to measure. So if more people vote in the contacted group afterward, there's only one thing it can be. The difference is the contact. It's not the weather, it's not the candidate, it's not the national mood. The thing that you did is the difference. They tried three forms of contact: a big postcard in the mail, a phone call from a call center, and a volunteer knocking at the door. The phone calls moved turnout by nothing. You could measure it. The mail moved it a sliver, about a 0.5% per postcard, and the door moved it 7 points. The real revelation was in the group of voters who were successfully visited by one of the student teams. They turned out at a rate 7 percentage points higher than the control sample. This impact was larger than the margin of most competitive elections. So there's two things happening here. The first is those 7 points are enormous, bigger than the gap that decides most close races. And the second is the finding that quietly rearranged how campaigns think about all this. Maybe one way you could get people to vote was simply to have other people ask them to. The active ingredient was not a clever script. It was presence, one human being, face to face, asking another. 3 decades of slick broadcast advertising had been busy replacing exactly the thing that works best in these campaigns. Let me bring that home for our world. In public affairs, your version of the phone bank is whatever you keep doing simply because everyone in the field does it. The mass email blast, the templated AstroTurf campaign, things that have never once tested against a do-nothing comparison group. So the lesson here isn't just stop doing a thing that doesn't work. It is find out whether it actually does work and have the discipline to put yourself through that testing regime. All right, the next mechanism is the lens. It's about finding the right person. So if the experiment tells you what works on average, the next question is on whom? That's targeting. And the breakthrough here is a slip that sounds backwards until it clicks. So Hal Malchow was a Democratic consultant who specialized in campaign mail. He had grown frustrated with the usual polling. When you ask 100 questions of a small sample and then try to slice the answers into little subgroups, the numbers get so shaky that they're useless. So Hal Malchow turned the whole problem inside out. Ask just 1 or 2 questions, but ask them of a very large number of people. Learn a little bit about what they think and a lot about who they are. Malchow wanted to invert the quality of the data. More information on the people, less on their views. So instead of contacting a small sample with a long battery of questions, he wondered why the campaign couldn't ask just 1 or 2 questions of a lot of people. So from there, Hal Malchow would build what is basically a decision tree. In one Oregon race, he surveyed 9,000 voters, then started splitting them into even smaller groups, first by region, then education, then family size, hunting for the pocket with the highest share of genuinely undecided people. And he landed on a very specific type: young voters in neighborhoods with lots of kids and few university degrees who were undecided at nearly 60%. Those were the working class swing voters every campaign chases, and now he could find them by name. A dollar aimed at them went twice as far. So the question had quietly shifted from what does the electorate think to what exact people are worth my next dollar. Now, fast forward to 2002, a data specialist named Alex Gage is pitching this approach to the campaign of Mitt Romney, who was then running for governor of Massachusetts. And the room is full of former management consultants. Alex Gage explains how you could merge consumer data with voter records to build a rich profile of each individual. And one of the people in that room, a man named Alex Dunn, a former venture capitalist who was serving as Mitt Romney's deputy campaign manager, stops him with a question that says everything about the state of the profession at this point. And the question is this: you mean you don't do this in politics? The business world had been profiling individual customers for years, and politics, the field that more or less invented opinion polling, had fallen behind the people who sell credit cards. Alex Gage's solution was something he called a consideration score, a simple 0 to 10 rating of how likely a given person was to even entertain voting for his candidate. So the campaign's volunteers could stop guessing and knock on the doors most likely to pay off. One honest caution, though, and the book raises it itself, the score is an educated guess about a person you have never actually spoken to. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to this where it breaks down. All right, the next mechanism is the finding. Turnout is a craft and it can be measured. This is the one spot where the book brushes up against the territory we have touched on in that earlier Robert Cialdini episode. So let me be careful and keep it self-contained. The experiments kept pointing the same way. Turnout, the unglamorous work of getting people who already agree with you to actually show up, had been badly undervalued. And the most powerful version of it was human and face-to-face. Volunteers beat paid callers. Neighbors beat strangers. The further the contact drifted from a real human relationship, the weaker it got. And then came the result the book is most famous for, a Michigan political consultant named Mark Grebner, working again with Alan Gerber and Donald Green, mailed out a letter unlike anything voters had seen before. It listed each household's own voting record, whether they had voted in past elections, right alongside their neighbors' records, with a promise to mail an updated version after the election so that the whole street could see who had shown up and who had not. And the result was startling, right? Turnout in that group jumped to almost 38% against 30% for the group that was left alone. Among those who received the neighbor's letter, 37.8% voted, which meant it was roughly 3 times more effective at increasing turnout than any other piece of mail ever tested. Roughly 3 times more powerful than anything else they had ever mailed, at about $2 per extra vote. Now, why does seeing your neighbor's voting records light a fire under you? Well, it comes down to something psychologists call social proof. Our deep instinct to fall in line with what the people around us are seen to be doing. This is the territory that Robert Cialdini mapped in his book Influence that we covered in a previous episode. If you heard our episode on it, this is familiar, right? If you didn't, that one sentence is really all you need here. What Sasha Issenberg adds is the part the psychology lab could never give us, which is the price tag, the actual measured dollars per vote cost of leaning on shame. The earlier book told us that lever exists. This one weighs exactly how far it can move. And it leaves us with a genuinely hard problem. And here's how Donald Green puts it. How can you take this static electricity and turn it into useful current? And he asked that question because obviously a lot of voters became extremely angry with this tactic. It is not a viable tactic for the average political campaign. It might work for a behavioral science experiment, as a civic experiment, but it cannot work in a political context. The most effective tool anyone had ever measured was also one that no candidate would dare put their name on because it read like a threat. So the real question stops being what works and becomes what works that you could actually decently use. And that is a harder question to answer. And it's a thing that we have to grapple with in our profession on a regular basis. All right, let's move on to mental models. I'm going to give you 3 ways of seeing the world that this book hands you. Each one is a real thing that's out there, whether you notice it or not. But these were my big ones. The first is the lore tax. Any field that runs on inherited belief instead of evidence pays a tax. And that tax is paid in money spent on things that don't actually work. The campaign that books the phone bank every cycle because campaigns book phone banks is paying this tax. So is a trade association that flies its members to the Capitol for the same meetings every spring because last year it flew them to the Capitol. The tax is invisible precisely because nobody runs the comparison group that would reveal it, and the longer a practice goes untested, the more confident everyone gets that it must be working. Okay, the second mental model is the untestable channels. So some of your tools can be isolated and measured, and some can't. And that one difference quietly decides what a whole field believes in. A knock on a door can be given to one person and withheld from their neighbor. So as a result, it can be measured. A television ad reaches everyone in range at once, so it's difficult to measure it appropriately. The result is a strange, lopsided map of knowledge. We know the price of a vote from a door knocking exercise almost to the dollar, and we know next to nothing solid about the 30-second TV spot that eats most of the budget. What gets measured is what holds still, which is not the same as what matters most. The third mental model is the margin game. Most of the contests that count are decided at the edges, not in the middle. A lift of 2 or 3% from a stack of letters sounds like a rounding error until you remember how many real elections are won by less than that margin. This is the fact that makes the whole enterprise rational. In a margin game, a small, real, measured effect beats a big, imagined one every time. It also explains the temperament of the people in this book. They're not chasing a knockout punch. They are after the 2 points nobody else can even see. Now, let me head off 4 ways people walk away from this book having read it wrong. So these are common misunderstandings that I think every author faces when they pen their book. For this book, The Victory Lab, the first misunderstanding is to see this as a type of manipulation manual. The title invites this misread, right? The subtitle is The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns, pushing buttons, exploiting weaknesses, but the book's own story cuts the other way. Its single strongest discovery, that big letter that we've spent a lot of time talking about, is pretty much unusable because it reads as a threat. So when we read this closely, it's less a manual for pushing buttons than the record of a whole field discovering how little it actually knew. And what comes through in the end is humility, earned the hard way in the campaign environment. So that's one big common misunderstanding. The second is that data killed old-fashioned door knocking. So this is, of course, what the opposite of what the data found. The strongest measured effect anyone turned up in all of this was a volunteer at a door. The numbers didn't replace the human touch. They proved its value and told campaigns where to aim it. Jeremy Bird, who ran the on-the-ground organizing for Barack Obama's 2008 campaign, names the myth head on. The idea that if you're using smart data, you must have stopped doing real relationship-based organizing. In truth, the targeting is what lets the relationship land on the right doorstep. So use the data to enable relationship building. The third misunderstanding is that this science lets campaigns manufacture voters out of thin air. The measured effects are mostly small, a couple of points, and many of them fade fast. In fact, we even see in this book the degree to which massive TV ad buys have a positive impact while they're in market, but they quickly fade. This is a science of nudging people at the margin, not conjuring them up for nothing. All right, the fourth misunderstanding is that elections are basically a solved problem. The book ends on exactly the opposite note, of course. The models go stale, an electorate shifts, and the formula trained on last year's voters confidently gives you the wrong answer. Much in the same way that today AI can often, with confidence, give us the wrong answer. Barack Obama's run broke models that had been built on the assumption that the future would look like the past. And every edge wears off as the other side learns it too. The secret science, I think, is a foot race. It's not a finish line. Stand still and you're going to lose. Can you find a way to innovate on the next campaign? If you do, be prepared that the other side is going to catch up. And when that happens, are you ready to innovate all over again? Okay, let's take a look at what all this means for those of us doing public affairs today, not running a presidential field operation. And there are 4 translations. Each one, I think, maps to a specific thing that the book proved. And so number 1 is hold out a comparison group. This is the New Haven move, right? And it costs nothing to borrow. I'm not saying it costs nothing to implement, but it costs nothing to borrow. The next time you send an advocacy email to your list, or activate a coalition, or run a constituent contact push, hold a randomly chosen slice of your audience back, then send them nothing and compare. This is the entire difference between someone who can only report how many alerts went out and someone who can actually say which alert moved a vote. If your job is running a coalition in a heavily regulated industry or leading a grassroots advocacy team, you almost certainly live and die by numbers you cannot easily and readily defend. The held back comparison group is how you start to defend them. Okay, number 2 is to spend on presence, not on noise. We know that door beats the phone, volunteer beats paid, neighbor beats stranger. Picture someone whose job is to build community goodwill for a new technology before the regulators weigh in. Say the public affairs lead for a self-driving car company trying to earn a town's trust before the rules get written. For that person, Presence beats noise is most of the strategy in a single line, but it carries a warning too. Remember that the neighbor's letter worked and was still unusable because it crossed a line into coercion. There's a principle we keep coming back to on this show, and that the instant an influence effort is seen as bought or staged, it doesn't just stop working, it just actively backfires on you. So surface your genuine supporters, never manufacture fake ones. All right, the third application is know who before you worry about the what. That work that Hal Malchow did with flipping his usage of polling questions and polling data and sample sizes, getting more information on the people, less on their views, translates cleanly to, I think, government relations. The more a valuable question to consider in this context is which legislatures have your issue near the top of their list of priorities and which have it near the bottom and which haven't got it on the list at all. That's Alex Gage's consideration score, just aimed at a legislator instead of an electorate. Okay, the fourth modern application would be to measure movement, not motion. I'm going to come back to Jeremy Bird here from the Obama operation. He had a sharp complaint. Who cares how many calls you placed if nobody answered them? That's the trap of counting motion instead of movement, and you see it everywhere. A public affairs team reports how many meetings it held and how much coverage it earned instead of whether any minds actually changed. It's the same habit you see in a lot of corporate sustainability or diversity reporting. Pages of impressive-looking activity that never quite proves anything changed. What this book adds is a higher standard. Find the one number you were truly hired to move and isolate your own effect on it. And a quick word from my own experience. After a provincial campaign I worked on in 2011, which is a campaign in which I applied a lot of what I learned actually from when I worked on the 2008 Obama campaign, applying a lot of the principles we learned about in this book. The thing that stayed with me wasn't that we lost that 2011 campaign. It was that we never really did a proper postmortem on it to ask what had actually worked and what hadn't. I say this because there's so much of what we done in that campaign that worked extremely well. Actually, we did a lot of stuff that were first for a Canadian campaign. But the story of all the innovation that we done in that campaign never got told because, well, we lost. And to the victor goes the spoils, of course. But there would have been a lot there for the party I was working for, the movement that we represented. There would have been a lot there for that movement to learn from, even if we didn't win. That dumpster Sasha Issenberg describes, where all the campaign's data ends up, it is real. It happens on so many campaigns. And I have myself seen it get filled up. And it is something that not only political campaigns need to better handle, but I would suggest there's a lot of learning that can come from the public affairs campaigns that you might be running. And the question is, are you capturing those learnings as best as you can? Are you going through the uncomfortable process of a postmortem even when you've lost? Or even when you've won, it's still a worthy exercise to go through. Okay, let's move on to the mastery lesson. The posture this book asks of you is a rare one in this business. The willingness to find out you were wrong on purpose at your own expense. Anyone can run an experiment. The hard part is genuinely wanting to know the answer. So the master here isn't the operator with the cleverest tactic in the toolkit. It's the one who keeps the comparison group even when keeping it means they can't take full credit for the win, and who runs the test that just might prove their signature move does nothing at all. That is less a technique than a temperament, and it runs against almost everything our profession rewards, right? What is our profession reward? The confident story, the air of having known it all along. This is particularly true if you're on the consulting side. You're expected to be a guru, to have all the right answers to everything. Here's the harder version, the one that I think we got to acknowledge very plainly. The discipline isn't loving data. Plenty of people love data. The discipline is being willing to put your own folklore to death, to take the move that made your reputation and set it in front of a comparison group that might embarrass it. Most people can't do that. The ones who can are the ones who keep getting better. And in public affairs, especially, the field quietly rewards the opposite. Longevity is the prize. Certainty is the product you're selling. And the consultant who survives the longest is often the one who never handed anyone a number they could check. To really absorb this book is to become, on purpose, the kind of practitioner who is easy to prove wrong, and so the kind who actually improves. Let's go back to that door in New Haven, a student standing on the step, clipboard in hand, a stranger answering. 7 points, the most effective thing anyone in that whole experiment did, and the oldest thing in all of politics. One person asking another to take part. The science didn't invent that. It was true back in 1924, and it stayed true through the half century the profession spent never bothering to check, and it stayed true underneath all the targeting and modeling that came later. What Alan Gerber and Donald Green's experiment did was give us permission to believe it, to stop guessing, withhold the knock from a random few, and let the count settle the argument once and for all. The people who never knock stay sure the knock doesn't matter. They simply never run the test that would tell them otherwise. And that not knowing is comfortable because it can never be graded. The fundamentals were there the whole time. The lab just made them impossible to ignore. That is the episode. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive on the Victory Lab. If you did, please give this a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It'll help me a lot with discoverability, help us grow this community. And if not, flip it to a friend or colleague who you think might enjoy this. And with that, I will catch you on the next one.